Get ready to take a glimpse behind the palace walls of the Mughals lay a hidden world, a harem of nearly 5,000 women. Desire, power, and secrets shaped the empire from inside these forbidden chambers. You hear the muffled sound of a conch shell echoing across the palace walls, announcing dawn in Fatehpur Sikri. The sandstone corridors glow faintly red as the first rays of sun slip through carved screens, lighting the silhouettes of women moving silently in the early hours. Behind these lattices lies a world few men ever saw, the harem of the Mughal emperors. A fortress within a fortress. A city within a city. A hidden empire of women, ruled by desire, politics, and secrecy. The word harem itself comes from the Arabic haram, meaning sacred, forbidden, untouchable. To outsiders, it suggested mystery and sensuality, but within the Mughal world, it meant order, hierarchy, and surveillance. This was not just a collection of wives and concubines. It was a highly organized institution that projected the emperor's power, wealth, and divine authority. The more elaborate the harem, the greater the emperor appeared in the eyes of his subjects and rivals. The origins of the Mughal harem lay far from India. Babur, the empire's founder, descended from Timur on one side and Genghis Khan on the other. In his native Central Asia, rulers maintained women's quarters both as symbols of wealth and as tools of diplomacy. When Babur carved out his first foothold in Hindustan, he carried this tradition with him. His son Humayun expanded it further, bringing in Persian influences after his exile and marriage alliances in Iran. But it was Akbar, the third emperor, who transformed the harem into something monumental. At its height, the Mughal harem could contain up to 5,000 women, wives of royal lineage, political brides given in alliance, purchased concubines, entertainers, and attendants. Imagine the logistics of maintaining such a vast hidden world. Kitchens had to prepare thousands of meals each day. Guards monitored every doorway. Eunuchs relayed messages from women to the emperor. Even clothing and jewelry required whole workshops dedicated to serving only the harem. What might appear to outsiders as indulgent luxury was, in reality, a massive political and economic machine. Architecture reflected this system of control. At Agra Fort and later at Delhi's Red Fort, the harem was built with elaborate passageways, screened balconies, and courtyards carefully designed to keep women secluded yet constantly visible to the emperor. No man outside the emperor and his trusted eunuchs was permitted inside. Even princes of royal blood could not freely enter the women's quarters. To break this law was to risk immediate execution. The harem was thus both sanctuary and prison, a place of unrivaled privilege and absolute restriction. The women who lived there came from everywhere: princesses married for alliances, Persian noblewomen who carried the sophistication of Isfahan into Indian palaces, Central Asian concubines brought along trade routes, and enslaved girls purchased from distant markets. Each brought fragments of her culture, fusing them into a distinctive Mughal blend: perfumes from Arabia, silks from China, jewels from Golconda, poetry from Persia. The harem was not merely Indian, Persian, or Central Asian. It was a cosmopolitan microcosm of the empire itself. To the outside world, it was impenetrable. Travelers, ambassadors, and merchants speculated endlessly about what lay behind those walls. Was it a paradise of pleasure, where the emperor drowned in indulgence? Or was it a gilded cage, where thousands of women lived under constant surveillance, competing for survival? The truth, as always, was more complicated, and far more human. The clang of bronze trays echoes down the marble hallways. Servants shuffle barefoot, balancing silver dishes of milk, almonds, and saffron-scented bread. Morning in the harem begins not with freedom, but with ritual. Every hour is accounted for, every gesture watched. To live inside the Mughal harem was to live in a world where beauty, etiquette, and obedience were cultivated as carefully as gardens of roses outside the palace walls. New arrivals, whether brides, purchased concubines, or gifted entertainers, were not simply left to fend for themselves. They entered into a rigorous system of training. Tutors instructed them in Persian poetry, music, embroidery, and the art of storytelling. Some were taught dance, others how to play instruments like the sitar or tabla. Every skill was a performance, every word rehearsed. A concubine was expected to be a jewel, polished, refined, and dazzling whenever summoned. Beauty was not left to chance. Cosmetics were prepared daily in the harem's own workshops. Black kohl outlined eyes, giving them the almond-shaped Mughal poets adored. Henna stained fingertips and feet in intricate patterns. Perfumes distilled from roses, jasmine, and sandalwood clung to skin and silk. Physicians of the harem prescribed elaborate regimens, herbal tonics to preserve fairness, oils to keep hair glossy, and even risky treatments to slow the marks of aging. For these women, beauty was survival. To lose it was to risk fading into obscurity, exiled from the emperor's gaze. Yet life in the harem was not endless pampering. It was a highly structured world, layered with hierarchy and rules. At the top sat the emperor's chief wives, often princesses of noble blood. Below them, favored concubines who had won his attention. Beneath those, lesser wives, attendants, and slaves. Each level came with privileges, private quarters, servants of their own, or special jewels. But it also meant rivalry. A misplaced word, a poorly executed performance, even a slip of the tongue at a gathering could ruin a woman's position forever. The daily rhythm unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. After morning prayers, women gathered in small salons to embroider, play music, or recite verses. Meals were served in communal halls, where gossip flowed as freely as sherbet. Afternoons might bring games of chess or cards, competitions of poetry, or rehearsals for performances. The emperor himself might appear at any hour, summoning his favorites, testing their wit, their knowledge, their ability to entertain him with charm and grace. To stumble in his presence was to invite mockery, or worse, indifference. Even festivals within the harem carried this dual nature of joy and restraint. During Holi, women showered each other with colored powders, their laughter echoing across courtyards unseen by the city outside. At Eid, gifts of jewels, silks, and coins were distributed, a reminder of the emperor's wealth. On birthdays or royal occasions, grand banquets filled the halls with music, dance, and perfumed air. Yet always, the celebrations were ringed by watchful eunuchs and guards, ensuring no boundary was ever crossed, no scandal ever risked. Isolation was the harem's most persistent companion. From behind jolly screens, women could glimpse the bustling courtyards, hear the sounds of merchants and soldiers, smell the spices roasting in the imperial kitchens. But they could not step beyond without permission. The outside world became a rumor, carried by eunuchs, visiting relatives, or fragments of conversation overheard through screens. To some women, the harem was safety from the chaos of the world. To others, it was a prison, gilded but inescapable. Still, even within its strict boundaries, women carved out spaces of companionship and subtle resistance. Friendships bloomed in embroidery circles. Rivalries sometimes softened into solidarity. A concubine might feign illness to avoid a summons. Another might use humor to distract from a rival's mistake. Survival inside the harem depended as much on wit and strategy as on beauty. Beneath the silks and perfumes lay constant negotiation: when to bow, when to speak, when to stay silent. To live in the Mughal harem was to live in contradiction, in silks and shackles, in music and surveillance, in luxury and loneliness. Every day was a performance staged for the emperor, but also a private battle to maintain dignity, favor, and hope. The harem was not merely a sanctuary of silks and perfumes. It was a theater of power, a place where alliances were forged, plots were whispered, and the future of the empire often hung on the decisions of women hidden behind screens. To imagine it only as a cage of idle concubines is to miss its sharpest edge. The harem could make or break emperors. At the top stood the emperor's chief consorts and mothers of princes, whose authority stretched far beyond the inner chambers. A single glance from the emperor could raise a concubine to immense power. A son born from her womb could secure her dominance for decades. The politics of the harem revolved around succession. Each woman who bore a prince was not just a mother, she was a potential kingmaker. Rivalries between mothers could ignite wars that consumed the empire itself. Consider the story of Nur Jahan, wife of Emperor Jahangir. She entered the harem as the widow of a Persian nobleman but rose to become one of the most powerful women in Indian history. For over a decade, Nur Jahan effectively ruled the empire alongside Jahangir, issuing imperial orders in her own name, striking coins with her image, and negotiating treaties with foreign rulers. She turned the harem from a private retreat into a nerve center of Mughal politics. Behind her silken veils, she was orchestrating military campaigns, trade routes, and diplomatic marriages. But Nur Jahan was not unique. Before her, Hamida Banu Begum, mother of Akbar, had played a critical role in legitimizing his throne during the turbulence of Humayun's exile. Later, Mumtaz Mahal, though remembered mostly as the muse for the Taj Mahal, wielded significant influence over Shah Jahan's court. Even less famous concubines could become shadow rulers if they won the emperor's enduring affection. The emperor's ear was the most coveted position in the empire, and many women learned to wield it with precision. Power, however, was not only about affection. It was about strategy. A concubine who cultivated alliances with eunuchs, generals, or viziers could extend her reach far beyond the harem walls. Eunuchs, in particular, acted as power brokers, carrying secret messages between women and statesmen, arranging marriages for allies, or quietly destroying rivals with rumors. Their neutrality was a myth, their influence was real. Intrigue flourished in this closed world. Poison was whispered about as much as perfume. A jeweled cup of wine could conceal a deadly tincture. A rivalry between two mothers might end in the quiet disappearance of one's child. The harem's silence to the outside world made it the perfect crucible for hidden struggles. To the empire, such events were mysteries; to the women inside, they were daily realities of survival. Yet, despite the danger, many women used their position to patronize art, architecture, and learning. They funded gardens, mosques, and schools. They commissioned works of poetry and miniature painting that still dazzle historians today. In their hands, power was not just political but cultural. The splendor of Mughal India owes as much to its emperors as to the women who quietly directed its wealth and taste. The paradox of the harem was this: it was both prison and parliament. To live within its walls was to lose one's freedom, but also to gain a unique opportunity. Behind the screens, unseen by the empire's masses, women decided which prince would rise, which minister would fall, and which policies would guide the throne. The harem was invisible to most, but its power was everywhere. The silks grew faded. The perfumes turned stale. What was once a shimmering jewel of the Mughal court slowly began to tarnish. The harem, once the very heart of imperial power, became in time a reflection of the empire's decline itself, luxurious on the surface, but hollowed from within. For the women inside, decline began with age. A concubine's beauty was her currency, and when youth slipped away, so too did her influence. Some were quietly moved into smaller quarters, stripped of jewels and attendants. Others were exiled to distant estates or religious retreats, their names forgotten even within palace walls. The same emperor who once showered them with pearls might pass them in silence. To outlive one's desirability was to become invisible. Punishments grew harsher as rivalries sharpened. Betrayals, real or imagined, were met with ruthless consequences. Some women were imprisoned within the harem itself, their quarters turned into gilded cages. Others faced banishment to obscure fortresses or remote towns, cut off from the political stage. Rumors even whispered of executions, poison slipped into food, veils that concealed suffocation. In the cutthroat world of the harem, survival often depended less on beauty than on cunning. The stakes rose highest during succession struggles. When an emperor died, the harem became a battlefield of mothers. Each prince's survival meant the survival of his mother. Rival queens schemed, bribed eunuchs, and plotted assassinations to ensure their sons ascended the throne. The bloody war of Shah Jahan's sons, Dar Shikoh, Aurangzeb, Murad, and Shuja, was fueled in no small part by harem politics. Behind the battlefield drums were whispers from the Zenana, mothers urging sons to grasp the crown at any cost. When Aurangzeb seized power, the harem changed in character. His strict adherence to Islamic orthodoxy meant fewer festivals, less poetry, and a reduced display of luxury. Music and dance, once central to harem life, were curtailed. The grandeur of Akbar and Jahangir's harems dimmed under austerity. For the women, the shift meant less public influence, fewer opportunities for cultural patronage, and more rigid confinement. Pleasure was eclipsed by piety, but the structure of control remained. By the 18th century, the Mughal Empire itself was fragmenting under the pressure of invasions, rebellions, and economic decline. As imperial coffers emptied, the harem shrank in size and splendor. Where once thousands of women lived amid silks and gemstones, later harems were smaller, their resources stretched thin. Eunuchs were unpaid, attendants neglected their duties, and former concubines found themselves sold or abandoned. The fortress of secrecy that had once symbolized imperial might began to resemble a relic of excess, increasingly out of step with the crumbling empire outside its walls. The final blow came with the arrival of new powers, Marathas, Persians, Afghans, and eventually the British. Foreign soldiers stormed palaces, looting treasures and scattering harem households. What had been the most private and guarded realm of the Mughal emperors was violated by invaders who saw no sanctity in its walls. The women who had once shaped the destinies of emperors were reduced to pawns, bargaining chips, or captives in the chaos of conquest. The decline of the harem mirrored the decline of the empire itself, from a glittering heart of politics and culture to a faded echo of vanished glory. What remained were fragments, jewels sold in markets, miniatures depicting an idealized past, and ruins of palaces where anklets once chimed and whispers once carried the weight of dynasties. When the palaces fell silent and the anklets no longer chimed, the harem did not disappear. It lived on in stories, paintings, and whispers that traveled across centuries. For many, the harem became less a place than an idea, a symbol of hidden power, forbidden beauty, and imperial decadence. Yet as with all legacies, the truth was far more complicated than the myths it inspired. European travelers were among the first to spread tales of the Mughal harem beyond India. Merchants, Jesuit priests and adventurers peered from a distance and wrote lurid accounts of what they imagined inside: pools of women, endless banquets of pleasure, emperors drowning in sensuality. Most of these men never saw the harem at all. Their stories were embroidered with fantasy, blending observation with Oriental imagination. In Europe, the harem became an exotic symbol of despotism, proof, in their eyes, of the supposed excesses of the East. But Mughal chroniclers told a different story. Court historians like Abul Fazl described the harem with reverence, emphasizing its discipline, its order, its role as an extension of imperial majesty. They wrote of thousands of women living in harmony, supervised by eunuchs, ruled with justice by the emperor. Their accounts reveal as much about what they wanted to portray as about reality. To them, the harem was not scandal but sovereignty, proof of the emperor's wealth, control, and divine authority. Art preserved another layer of memory. Mughal miniatures depicted women in the harem as ethereal beauties, reclining on carpets, playing sitars, or writing letters in candlelight. These paintings are exquisite, but they are also sanitized. They show the harem as paradise, jeweled women against golden backdrops, perfumed gardens under moonlight. What they do not show are the rivalries, the punishments, the loneliness. The art was not meant to record reality but to project an image of refinement, culture, and romance. Even the names of concubines often disappeared from record. A handful of powerful women, Nura Jahan, Mumtaz Mahal, Hamida Banu, are remembered. But thousands of others remain anonymous, their lives erased from official histories. Their traces survive only in fragments, a note in an account book, a mention in a letter, a name scratched into palace graffiti. The silence of the harem is as telling as its spectacle. It reveals whose voices empires chose to preserve, and whose they erased. Yet the influence of the harem endured. Its traditions of poetry, music, dress, and etiquette shaped later Indian courts, from the Nawabs of Awadh to the Nizams of Hyderabad. Beauty rituals, storytelling traditions, and artistic patronage seated by the harem continued to flourish long after the empire declined. The Mughal harem was gone, but its cultural echoes lingered in the songs sung in courtyards, the scents of attar in bazaars, the veils and silks worn by women across the subcontinent. The legacy of the Mughal harem is thus twofold. On one hand, it is wrapped in myth, a romanticized and exoticized image of hidden luxury. On the other, it is shadowed by silence, the absence of women's own voices. What we inherit today is a mosaic of rumor, propaganda, art, and archaeology, fragments that hint at both splendor and suffering. The ruins of Fatehpur Sikri stand silent today. Empty courtyards where once thousands of voices mingled now echo only with the footsteps of tourists. Jolly screens that once concealed women's faces are broken, sunlight pouring freely where shadows once reigned. And yet, as you walk through these abandoned palaces, the silence feels heavy, as if the whispers of 5,000 women linger, unwilling to fade completely into history. The Mughal harem showed the empire's power and riches. It was a small city inside the palace: music, perfume, guarded rooms, and steady work by cooks, tailors, and jewelers. Influence moved here quietly, room to room, as surely as it did in public courts. It was also a tool of both pleasure and power. Who was called in, who was kept waiting, and who was favored could shape alliances. A single meeting could lift or sink a career. A birth could change the line of succession. Over time the rules tightened, fortunes rose and fell, and the great Mughal harem thinned out. What remains are buildings, a few records, a few names on coins. Most lives faded from the page. Nothing lasts forever. The rooms are empty now, the fountains are dry. What many once called a private paradise lies in ruins, open to sun and rain. The carved screens still cast their patterns on the floor. That is where this story ends.